Kerrys Debacle in Vienna by Mike Whitney, November 3, 2015. informationclearinghouse.info. Counterpunch. Can someone explain to me why President Obama decided to announce that he's going to deploy U.S. Special Forces to Syria on the same day that Secretary of State John Kerry was scheduled to meet with Russian and Iranian diplomats to discuss how to end the 4.5-year-long war? What was that all about? Did he think he was going to scare the Russians and Iranians by rattling a few sabers? Did he think that they'd call off their military offensive and withdraw their support for Assad? What was he thinking? Even Kerry was embarrassed by the announcement, which accomplished nothing except to convince the attendees that U.S. foreign policy is concocted by amateurs who have no idea what they're doing. That's all it achieved. According to the New York Times, quote, Mr. Kerry told reporters the timing of the announcement was a coincidence, and that he was not aware a decision had been made until earlier Friday. Obama sends special operations forces to help fight ISIS in Syria, New York Times. A coincidence. Kerry thinks it was a coincidence? Fortunately, the Times isn't nearly as clueless as Kerry. In fact, they even admit what their real objective was. Check it out. President Obama announced on Friday that he had ordered several dozen special operations troops into Syria for the first open-ended mission by United States ground forces in that country. The dispatch of American troops was meant to bolster diplomatic efforts by Secretary of State John Kerry, who on Friday reached an agreement in Vienna with countries with opposing stakes to explore a nationwide ceasefire. Obama sends special operations forces to help fight ISIS in Syria, New York Times. See, it wasn't a coincidence at all. It was intentional. It was designed to, quote, bolster diplomatic efforts by Secretary of State John Kerry. In other words, it was a threat, pure and simple. To really appreciate how short-sighted the move was, we need to try to understand why these talks were convened to begin with. What's the purpose of these negotiations, and who requested them? Well, Washington requested them. Not Russia, not Iran, not Saudi Arabia, not Turkey, and not Europe. Washington. And the reason Washington wanted these meetings is because, as the Times says, they want, quote, to explore a nationwide ceasefire. The administration wants to stop the fighting. Now. That's why Kerry has been running around like a chicken with his head cut off, to get all the diplomats together in one place ASAP. But don't presume for a minute that because Washington wants a ceasefire, that they also want a political solution or negotiated settlement or peace, because they don't. Peace isn't even on the agenda, and it never has been. For the last 4.5 years, the U.S. has been supporting Sunni extremists and other militant groups to make sure that peace is avoided at all cost, because peace would be an obstacle for the real objective, which is regime change. So what changed? In other words, why is Kerry so eager to convene meetings now when he's had every opportunity to call off the dogs for the last 4 years? What changed is Vladimir Putin. Putin got sick and tired of the U.S. ripping these Middle East countries to shreds and decided to put an end to it. So he formed a coalition, the 4+1, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Hezbollah, and started bombing the hell out of the jihadis. This created a big problem for Washington because many of these violent extremists have been armed and trained by the U.S. They're Washington's guys, and they've been doing Washington's dirty work by prosecuting a proxy war that is designed to topple Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. That's why Kerry convened the meetings, because he needs a ceasefire to save as many of these U.S.-backed scoundrels as possible. Here's Kerry's actual statement following Friday's confab. Quote, the theory of the ceasefire is very simple. Certain parties control or influence people with guns and the ability to fight. And if we do reach an agreement with respect to some of the road forward, there would be a responsibility for those with influence and those with those who have direct control over certain parties. They would control them. Obviously, with respect to Daesh and al-Nusra, there is no ceasefire. There would be none. And those are the early parameters. But much more needs to be discussed between militaries, the politics. There are all kinds of possibilities, but they remain to be explored. Does it seem to you, dear reader, that Kerry is a lot more interested in working out the particulars of a ceasefire than he is in ending the conflict? That's because his real aim is not peace and humanitarian assistance, but saving as many of these bloodthirsty hyenas as possible. That's Washington's goal. Why does it matter? It matters because if Washington doesn't really want peace, then we have to assume that the talks are a charade and that Kerry is just buying time so he can regroup his forces and resume the war at a later date. How do we know this? We know it because Kerry delivered a speech to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace the day before he left for Vienna, in which he announced exactly what the U.S. strategy is. Here's what he said. Quote, in northern Syria, the coalition and its partners have pushed Daesh, ISIS, out of more than 17,000 square kilometers of territory, and we have secured the Turkish-Syrian border east of the Euphrates River. That's about 85% of the Turkish border, and the president is authorizing further activities to secure the rest. We're also enhancing our campaign in order to help drive Daesh, which once dominated the Syria-Turkey border, out of the last 70-mile stretch that it controls. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry on the future of U.S. policy in the Middle East, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. There it is in black and white. Kerry is basically telling his inner circle friends that Washington is moving on to Plan B, a fallback plan that will involve the establishment of a, quote, safe zone on the Syrian side of the Syrian-Turkish border where the U.S. and its partners can continue to arm, train, and deploy their jihadi hoodlums back into Syria whenever they choose to do so. So now we know what Obama's special forces are really going to be doing in Syria, don't we? They're going to be overseeing operations that will put this plan into motion. How do you think Putin is going to like the idea that Washington wants to annex sovereign Syrian territory so they can continue hostilities for the foreseeable future? He's not going to like it at all. In fact, it could be a big problem for him if the U.S. secures an area where it can dig in for the long haul. Then they might actually succeed in turning the conflict into another Afghanistan-type quagmire, which appears to be what many of Washington's strategic planners actually want. So what should Putin do? How does he achieve his objectives without getting bogged down? Well, the first thing he's got to do is realize that Vienna is a joke. The Obama administration isn't serious about a diplomatic solution at all. It's all just smoke and mirrors. Kerry's admission that the U.S. controls, quote, about 85% of the Turkish border and the president is authorizing further activities to secure the rest proves beyond a doubt that Washington is already moving ahead with Plan B. That's the whole deal in a nutshell. Putin has probably already figured out that Vienna is a fraud, which would explain why his main man, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, has refused to make any concessions on any of the points that are being discussed in Vienna. As far as Lavrov is concerned, all of Russia's demands are going to be met, or there's not going to be a deal. The state and its institutions will remain intact. The terrorist groups will be exterminated. Assad will be a part of the transitional government, and the Syrian people will decide for themselves who leads them in the future. This is the basic Geneva roadmap, and Lavrov is sticking to it like glue. Washington is going to comply because they're not going to be given a choice in the matter. As for the ceasefire, well, Lavrov shot down that idea too. Here's what he said. Quote, if a ceasefire is declared, no terrorist organizations should be subjected to it. In other words, the Russian-led coalition is going to keep killing these jokers until every last one of them is dead. This statement hasn't appeared in any Western media, probably because it clarifies who is really setting the agenda. Russia is setting the agenda. It also suggests that there is no wiggle room in Moscow's approach, and there isn't. The terrorists, moderate or radical, are going to be hunted down and exterminated. End of story. There's something else Lavrov said, quote, Russia remains firm on its position that fighting terrorism should be conducted in accordance with the solid basis of international law, whether we are talking about the military interventions from air or ground operations. These need to be conducted in agreement with the government or with the UN Security Council. In other words, if a country, like the US, decides to conduct military operations in Syria illegally, which it is, then they do so at their own risk. Russia is going to continue to aggressively implement its battle plan, whether U.S. Special Forces put themselves in harm's way or not. Also, the Russian-led offensive is going to reestablish Syria's sovereign borders. If Obama wants to claim a part of Syria's territory as a refuge for his for-hire assassins, then he'd better be prepared to fight for it, because that's what it's going to take. Putin has shown a remarkable ability to anticipate Washington's moves and take preemptive steps to minimize their impact. Even so, it's going to be tough sledding if Obama is able to create a sanctuary on the Turkish border where jihadis can enter and exit Syria at will, keeping the country in a permanent state of turmoil. In that case, Putin would face his worst nightmare, the prospect of staying in Syria forever. Does Putin have something up his sleeve to counter this threat? Would he, for example, be willing to deploy his own elite shock troops from the 7th Guards Airborne Assault Mountain Division, who have been spotted around Latakia to wrest control of the border from rebel fighters, thus putting a swift end to Washington's twisted plan to create a safe zone, splinter Syria into smaller statelets, and create a permanent haven for Islamic extremists? Putin sees terrorism as a direct threat to Russia's national security. He's going to do whatever it takes to defeat the enemy and win the war. If that means he's got to put Russian boots on the ground to get the job done, then that's what he'll do. What's the big deal between Russia and the Saudis? By Pepe Escobar. November 5, 2015, informationclearinghouse.info. RT. DOHA, amid the wilderness of mirrors surrounding the Syrian tragedy, a diamond-shaped fact persists. Despite so many degrees of separation, the Saudis are still talking to the Russians. Why? A key reason is because a perennially paranoid House of Saud feels betrayed by their American protectors who, under the Obama administration, seem to have given up on isolating Iran. The Saudis can't intellectually understand the seesaw of incoherent Beltway policies due to the power struggle between Zionist neocons and the old establishment. No wonder they might be tempted to move to the Russian side of the fence. But for that to happen, there will be many a price to pay. Let's talk about oil. In energy terms, an oil deal with the House of Saud would mean a lot to Russia. A deal could produce incremental oil revenue for Moscow of about $180 billion a year. The rest of the GCC does not really count. Kuwait is a U.S. protectorate, Bahrain is a Saudi resort area, Dubai is a glitzy heroin money laundering operation. The UAE itself is a wealthy group of pearl divers, and Qatar, as Bandar Bush famously remarked, is, quote, 300 people and a TV station, plus a decent airline that sponsors Barcelona. Riyadh, paranoid included, fully took note of the Obama administration's supposed policy of dumping Saudi Arabia over an alleged Iranian natural gas bonanza, which would supposedly replace Gazprom in supplying Europe. That won't happen, however, because Iran needs at least $180 billion in long-term investment to upgrade its energy infrastructure. Moscow, for its part, fully took note how Washington blocked South Stream. It's also been trying to block Turk Stream, but that may come to nothing after Erdogan's recent election landslide in Turkey. Additionally, Washington has been pressuring Finland, Sweden, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe to weaponize further against Russia and NATO. The king goes to Vlad. From the House of Saud's point of view, three factors are paramount. One, a general sense of red alert of they have been deprived from an exclusive relationship with Washington, thus becoming incapable of shaping U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Two, they have been mightily impressed by Moscow's swift counterterrorism operation in Syria. Yeah, impressed. Three, they fear like the plague the current Russia-Iran alliance if they have no means of influencing it. Russia faces battle with Saudi Arabia over European oil market share. RT, October 18. That explains why King Salman's advisors have pressed the point that the House of Saud has a much better chance of checking Iran on all matters, from Iraq to Yemen, if it forges a closer relationship with Moscow. In fact, King Salman will be visiting Putin before the end of the year. Tehran's priority, on the other hand, is to sell as much natural gas as possible. That makes Iran a natural competitor with Gazprom, not for the moment, as most extra exports will be directed towards Asia, not Europe. In terms of natural gas, there's no Russia-Saudi competition. Oil is a different story. A Russian-Saudi partnership would make sense in the framework of an OPEC cutback, if only they could find a deal over the Syria tragedy. One of the untold stories about the recent Syria-driven diplomatic flurry is how Moscow has been silently working on mollifying both Saudi Arabia and Turkey behind the scenes. That was already the case when the foreign ministers of US, Russia, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia met before Vienna. Vienna was crucial not only because Iran was on the table for the first time, but also because of the presence of Egypt, incidentally fresh from recent discovery of new oil reserves, and engaging in a reinforced relationship with Russia. The absolute key point was this paragraph included in Vienna's final declaration, quote, "This political process will be Syrian-led and Syrian-owned, and the Syrian people will decide the future of Syria." It's not by accident that only Russian and Iranian media chose to give the paragraph the appropriate relevance, because this meant the actual death of the regime change obsession, much to the distress of U.S. neocons, Erdogan, and the House of Saud. That does not necessarily mean the Russia-Iran alliance agrees 100% on Syria. This week, IRGC Commander Major General Mohammad Ali Jafari once again explained Iran does not see any alternative to Bashar al-Assad as leader of Syria. He even acknowledged Moscow might not entirely share this view, which is exactly what Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova has been saying. But that's not the main point. The main point is the death of the regime change option brought about by Moscow. And that leaves Putin free to further project his extremely elaborate strategy. He called Erdogan on Wednesday to congratulate him on his and the AKP's election landslide. This means that now Moscow clearly has someone to talk to in Ankara, not only about Syria, but also about gas. Putin and Erdogan will have a crucial energy-related meeting at the G20 summit on November 15 in Turkey. And there's an upcoming visit by Erdogan to Moscow. Bets are on that the Turkish Stream agreement will be, finally, reached before the end of the year. And on northern Syria, Erdogan has been forced to admit by Russian facts on the ground and skies that his no-fly zone scheme will never fly. Slouching towards Mecca. That leaves us with the much larger problem, the House of Saud. There's a wall of silence surrounding the number one reason for Saudi Arabia to bomb and invade Yemen, and that is to exploit Yemen's virgin oil lands, side by side with Israel, no less. Not to mention the strategic foolishness of picking a fight with redoubtable warriors such as the Houthis, which have Saud panic amidst the pathetic, mercenary-crammed Saudi army. Riyadh, following its American reflexes, even resorted to recruiting Academi, formerly Blackwater, to round up the usual mercenary suspects as far away as Colombia. It was also suspected from the beginning, but now it's a done deal that the responsible actor for the costly Yemen military disaster is none other than Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the king's son, who, crucially, was sent by his father to meet Putin face to face. To compound the turmoil, the Yemen disaster has unleashed some hardcore shadow play in Riyadh involving those sidelined by the Salman reign, especially former King Abdullah's clan. A nasty mess does not even begin to describe it. Meanwhile, Qatar will keep crying because it was counting on Syria as a destination point for its much-coveted gas pipeline to serve European customers, or at least as a key transit hub on the way to Turkey. Iran, on the other hand, needed both Iraq and Syria for the rival Iran-Iraq-Syria gas pipeline because Tehran could not rely on Ankara while it was under U.S. sanctions. This will now change fast. The point is, Iranian gas won't replace Gazprom as a major source for the EU anytime soon. If it ever did, or course, that would be a savage blow to Russia. Putin and Saudi defense minister meet in Russia, agree on common goals in Syria. Trending Russia news, October 12. In oil terms, Russia and the Saudis are natural allies. Saudi Arabia cannot export natural gas. Qatar can. To get their finances in order, after all, even the IMF knows they're on a highway to hell. The Saudis would have to cut back around 10% of production with OPEC. In concert with Russia, the oil price would more than double. No. A 10% cutback would make a fortune for the House of Saud. So for both Moscow and Riyadh, a deal on the oil price, to be eventually pushed towards $100 a barrel, would make total economic sense. Arguably, in both cases, it might even mean a matter of national security. But it won't be easy. OPEC's latest report assumes a basket of crude oil to be quoted at only $55 in 2012 and to rise by $5 a year, reaching $80 only by 2020. That sounds about right. This state of affairs does not suit either Moscow or Riyadh. Meanwhile, fomenting all sorts of wild speculation, ISIS, Daesh, still manages to collect as much as $50 million a month from selling crude from oil fields it controls across Iraq, according to the best Iraq-based estimates. That's wrong. The fact that this mini-oil caliphate is able to bring in equipment and technical experts from abroad to keep its energy sector running beggars belief. Quote, abroad, in this context, means essentially Turkey. Engineers plus equipment for extraction, refinement, transportation, and energy production. One of the reasons this is happening is that the U.S.-led coalition of the dodgy opportunists, CDO, which includes Saudi Arabia and Turkey, is actually bombing the Syrian state energy infrastructure, not the mini-oil caliphate domains. So we have the proverbial international actors in the region de facto aiding ISIS-Daesh to sell crude to smugglers for as low as $10 a barrel. Saudis, as much as Russian intel, have noted how ISIS-Daesh is able to take over the most advanced U.S. equipment that takes months to master, but instead integrate it into their ops at once. This implies they must have been extensively trained. The Pentagon, meanwhile, sent and will be sending top military across Iraq with an overarching message: if you choose Russia, we won't help you. ISIS/Daesh, for their part, never talks about freeing Jerusalem. It's always about Mecca and Medina. So make no mistake, there's much more pointing to a possible Russia-Saudi deal than meets the eye.